everyone. My name is Professor Thomas Boving. I'm a Fulbright scholar at IIT Roorkee, and I am an expert in contaminant hydrogeology. Today I will be lecturing on conceptual site models and will explain how they're useful for the field of site remediation and site investigation. Let me start by recommending two textbooks. The first one is Contaminant Hydrogeology by Fetter, Boving, and Creamer, 2018, third edition. It is a textbook that highlights contaminant fate and transport processes, how contaminants move, how their movement can be quantified using analytical or numerical models. And the second book is by Suto-san and colleagues, 2016. It's Remediation Engineering. It sheds lights on various remediation technologies, in situ, ex situ. It also talks about conceptual site models, which is the topic of today's lecture. So let me begin to define what is a conceptual site model. A CSM, in short, is a written or an illustrative representation of the conditions and the physical, chemical, and biological processes that control the transport, migration, and potential impacts of contamination to the groundwater, to the soil, to the air, to the sediments. And this is with respect to human health and ecological receptors. In other words, a conceptual site model informs parties like the government, like the customers, or the consultants about how contaminants behave in the environment at the polluted site and what are the conditions under which they transport in soil, ground, water, surface water, or air. The development and refinement of a CSM helps to identify data gaps, investigative data gaps at the polluted site. It helps in the characterization of the sites, and it can ultimately support remedial decision making, meaning that a conceptual site model is a database that evolves over time, helps us to identify what we don't know and which information we need to return a polluted site to conditions where it's being useful in the future. A CSM can also assist environmental consultants and specialists to communicate effectively with their customers or the government or the oversight agencies the critical issues and the critical processes that are identified at the site. It also helps to support the remedial decision-making process, meaning that by a well thought out, well illustrated conceptual site model, we have a tool to communicate with our customers and the decision makers what are the issues at the site and what can be done about these issues. And that helps people who are not as familiar as many experts in engineering, who know about remediation technologies, who know about contaminant fate and transport and so on, to communicate these complex issues to people who simply don't have such a deep insight. And that is good for decision making, because an informed decision maker is a decision maker who makes the right decisions. So the basics of a conceptual site model is constructed by answering basically four questions: the when, the how, the what, and the where. So the when and how is about where did contaminants enter the subsurface. The what is, what are the contaminants of concern? And where did these contaminants reside today? And most important, where will they travel in the future? Next, I will go over all of these four questions one by one and give some comments to better understand the when, how, what, and wheres. Let's start with the how, because that's generally the easier question to answer, because often there is a report of an accident and a spill that speaks about how a contaminant got released to the environment. Also, during site investigations, the environmental consultant often comes along clear indications of pollution sources, such as an underground storage tank that leaks, like the one here. Clearly, you can see how liquid leaves the tank after it has been pulled from the ground. So a leaking underground storage tank is a good indication of how a contaminant got into the subsurface. Same is true for broken pipes or for clear indications of spills on the surface or on the property of a polluted site. The when is often much harder to determine unless a spill or an accident has been properly reported. That's not often the case because of negligence or other reasons. Many times we therefore don't really know exactly when the pollution problem started. That is because, for example, a leaking underground storage tank that I just mentioned before may have leaked small amounts, like a liter a day, for many, many years. And a liter a day from a tank that's, let's say, 50,000 liters large cannot be easily detected. A liter lost on a 50,000 liter tank, there's no way people will find a leak on the conventional old-style steel chamber storage tanks. Newer models have provisions to make such small leaks detectable, but for years and years we basically dealt with storage tanks that were single chamber without technology to detect small leaks. So it's totally plausible that over many years, thousands of liters of, let's say, gasoline have leaked into the subsurface undetected. So it becomes difficult to exactly pinpoint when the problem started. So the when is a much harder problem to answer than the how. What are the contaminants? Again, if the history of a polluted site is well known, then the consultant can predict with some certainty which contaminants are likely present. For example, if a site has been a gas station for 30 years, then it is likely that we will find contaminants like benzene, toluene, ethyl benzene, or the xylenes. And if you notice, the A, the B, the T, the E, the X make up what we call BTEX. So BTEX compounds are expected on gas station, petroleum, hydrocarbon sites. It may be diesel, which has a lower fraction of BTEX, a higher fraction of higher molecular petroleum hydrocarbons. If it's a site like metal cleaning or metal processing, then it becomes more likely that we find chlorinated solvents like TCE, TCA, and similar. But bottom line is, as long as we know how a site has been used historically, we should be able to tell what are the contaminants we are facing. However, there are many sites where mixtures of contaminants have been used, or the exact composition of these contaminants is hidden behind proprietary laws and information, because these compounds are copyrighted, not copyright but protected, trademarks. Their exact composition may not be known. For example, in a chemical factory, numerous products are being produced. For example, aqueous firefighting foams, like shown in the picture here. These are mixtures, complex mixtures of contaminants, and therefore it may be difficult at some sites to exactly pinpoint what are the contaminants we're dealing with. In that case, we would have to have a substantial laboratory screening procedure in place to identify organic contaminants, inorganic contaminants, using the many tools that modern labs have to offer. The next question is, where are the contaminants in the aquifer today? So that is primarily identifying the source zone, meaning the place, the location where the contamination originates. That's called the source zone. Okay, in this picture here, the source zone is identified at the area where we find the highest concentration. And from the source zone, a plume may spread. A plume is basically contaminants dissolved in the groundwater that's spreading in the direction of the flowing groundwater. So the plume is basically the green area in this picture here. That would be the plume. The plume spreads away from the source. At some sites, we have multiple source and multiple plumes, and these plumes can overlap and mix, which makes the where of the contaminant is today question much more harder to answer. Then the last question is, where will the contaminant travel in the future? And that brings us to contaminant fate and transport, meaning methods, theories, and tests that can be conducted to determine where contaminant may migrate, how quickly it migrates, or if there are differences in the migration patterns of different contaminants if we have multiple mixtures. To answer this complex question often requires field and laboratory studies as well as computational models like the one here. So it's a very time-consuming, expensive process, but it's needed because to tell the regulators or your customer where the contaminant is heading in the future will determine what we have to do today in order to prohibit or to interfere with the travel of poisonous compounds in the subsurface. So in other words, a conceptual site model, to build a conceptual site model takes time. It requires detective work. It means, for example, we need to conduct historical site investigations, reviewing old blueprints from many, many years before, finding out how a site has been used, has its use changed, has it been changed, let's say, from producing one product to another that involves different chemicals. It also involves extensive field investigations, starting with mapping, reviewing the geology, either from existing maps or from new information that can be obtained from well drilling. That also informs us about hydrogeology. And then, of course, we need to have groundwater and samples from the soil to take to a lab, have them analyze and confirm what type of contaminants are present and at what concentrations. And that list is long. This takes another class to talk about site investigation, but for building a conceptual site model, one needs, first of all, time, patience, and a good amount of money. Here's an example of a basic conceptual site model. This model has been informed by the site history and operations, by the contaminants that may be present or are present, as well as by the geology and hydrogeology. So what we're seeing here is the release zone, the site. So this would be the source zone. Okay, so the contaminant has entered here and has met the groundwater table, which we probably know, its elevation we probably know from drilling. And then as it dissolves into the groundwater, into the flowing groundwater, it forms a plume. Okay. And in this case, the plume dove to the bottom of the aquifer, forming what looks like a product, a free-flowing product, or a DNAPL, or dense non-aqueous phase liquid in the appropriate term. And then from there, with the groundwater flow direction, the TC in this case, that would be our contaminant, TC, which is short for trichloroethylene, is spreading towards what would be a receptor or groundwater discharge area, a creek. So in other words, we have the origin, the source, we have identified the contaminant, TCE, we have identified how the contaminant is spreading, and we have identified potential receptors, in this case a creek, where the contaminant is heading or has already arrived, as it seems to be the case in this very basic CSM. So again, very basic in terms of we have an understanding of what happened, where it happened, and what happens most likely in the future. That is only the beginning, because there are still many unanswered questions. Like, this is a two-dimensional depiction, and it doesn't inform us about many other important information, like the one shown here in this more complicated two-dimensional CSM. This CSM has, besides the source, in this case it's an above-ground storage tank, an AST, which spilled some residual DNAPL, again dense non-aqueous phase liquid, could be a chlorinated solvent, that has entered through the vadose zone into the saturated zone, has accumulated, formed a pool, and from the pool we have a plume of groundwater impacted by the contaminant, and the plume is spreading in the direction as indicated by those blue arrows. Similar to our previous slides, but this conceptual site model also includes exposure routes, for example, wind direction effects. We also have different receptors like plumes, vapors that can emanate from the dissolved volatile organic contaminants into a basement or basements of neighbors. We can also identify other potential contamination sources, pollution sources, in this case a gas station with a leaking underground storage tank. All right, so we have identified additional pathways, exposure routes, receptors, and other pollution sources. So again, our conceptual site model becomes more informed as more and more information becomes available, either during site investigations or research in the previous site use, or looking beyond the site actually into the neighborhood and finding out what else is going on. Another two-dimensional CSM could be something like a fence diagram of the plume distribution in relation to the aquifer geology. This is a little bit more sophisticated. It requires specialized computational programs, but again, it illustrates where the plume is now and in the context of the subsurface geology, hydrology. As more and more information becomes available through drilling, through geophysical and other site investigation methods, the picture of our CSM becomes more involved, turns eventually three-dimensional, and informs us about the three-dimensional structure of the plume, which is very useful because it allows us to not just look at the two-dimensional spreading of the plume, but also in the vertical direction if there are potential risks for other aquifers in deeper parts of the geological stratigraphy, or if the plume may move offsite or already has moved offsite, and so on and so on. In this particular example, you see the many blue lines here. These are monitoring or observation wells, and if you were to count them, you would count many, like 50 wells. And this kind of data set is not unusual at large sites where over many years, sometimes hundreds of wells have been drilled, thousands of samples have been collected, and all these data points are synthesized into a conceptual site model as the one here. So in other words, a conceptual site model can be a very complex database. Another example here is a three-dimensional CSM that is a computational simulation of the plume in all three dimensions. If this was an animated version of this particular CSM, you could turn it around, look at the plume from all sides, from the top, from the side, from the bottom, north, south, east, west. And this helps, again, to communicate, or basically initially to understand and then communicate the shape of the plume and what it means for neighboring properties, or what it means for the remediation of the plume in the future. So in other words, a conceptual site model is a living feature. It evolves as more and more information becomes available. Sometimes previous conceptual site model versions have to be discarded because new information contradicts beliefs up to that point and has to be redrawn. So it is an evolving feature which builds over time and builds on the data that an environmental hydrogeologist collects in the field and puts together. So an early conceptual site model could be as simple as a report, meaning we went out on the 5th of January 2023, investigated the gas station on the corner of MG Road and Republic Road, and we found so much Batex contaminants, and here's the table showing the data. That's it. That gives us some idea, but that's very simple, a basic model. It's static. And then as we get more information, we return to the site with a drill rig, we use geophysical methods to investigate the site. The model becomes more refined and becomes more updated. It's basically a dynamic system. And eventually, once we have so much data that a simple visualization is insufficient, we end up with a digital CSM, which is basically a database, a complex database of all the information that links spatial temporal variations with different ideas and theories, and basically generates a three-dimensional impression of what is going on at the site. So it becomes a very helpful tool, but again, it takes time to generate such a model, and a lot of money. So now let's say we have a CSM that we find appropriate and reliable, but we need to still understand how we have to use this CSM. So development and refinement of the CSM will help identify gaps in the characterization of the site and will help ultimately the remedial action. So in this graph here, we'll talk about each of these colored boxes, starting with how the CSM is developed initially, kind of reviewing what we already talked about. So basically the conceptualization phase. And as the data gets more detailed, we eventually end up where, as engineers, we can quantify solutions, identify the cost and the duration it takes to turn a site from polluted to remediated. So at the conceptualization state, we start with defining the project objectives. What is it what we need to do? What are the contaminants? What are the hydrology? What are we up against? What are we facing? Okay, and with all that information about the environment, the history of the site, the hydrology, the types of contaminants, the when, how, where, and when, we basically will be able to develop a preliminary conceptual site model. Okay, CSM. Okay, first stage, conceptualization. Then in the next stage, we have to assess the contaminant transport. That is determining where are the contaminants now, where will they be in the future. That includes mapping based on field observations and characterization, superficial flow characterization, again based on field observation, which together allow us to determine how much contaminant mass is there and where is that mass heading, where is the plume, the source of the plume, where will it be in the future. So the assessment of contaminant transport is the next step in the CSM. That gets us to the next step, which is the remediation approach selection or approaches. It may be necessary to fight multiple contaminants or multiple source zones with not just one but multiple remediation technologies. So again, it begins with an exposure assessment. What are the contaminants? Where are they going? What are the receptors, exposure pathways? And very important, what is the regulatory framework? What are the regulatory conditions under which our remediation approach has to be implemented? And when this is done, we go to the next step, and that is the remediation selection and implementation. So we are now at a stage where we picked a remediation technology that's appropriate to the site conditions that we have painstakingly monitored and formed our CSM for. Now we have to identify how do we optimize the remediation strategy that was identified in the previous step. And this is a design process. It's an adaptive design process. It is picking a remediation technology, maybe conducting pilot testing, maybe conducting tracer testing, and end up with a design. It's a preliminary design. And that preliminary design will have to be adapted through what we call an adaptive design process into ultimately the field scale remediation technology that may be on the site for many, many years. So again, stepwise process, very time consuming, again, because it's a process that involves many people, a team of hydrologists, geologists, engineers, lawyers, health experts, biologists, chemists, and whatnot. The more complex the site, the larger the team, because nobody can do it by themselves. And that is actually one reason why I personally like to be in this arena, in this field, because you work with specialists from many different areas to solve a highly complex three-dimensional problem with the best technology at hand. And again, after this process is over, hopefully the remediation of the site is completed and the site can be returned to a beneficial use of some sort. Now, in the next part of the lecture, I will be talking more about the adaptive design strategy, which is an important part in any engineering planning. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you again very soon. Thank you.